What's good, guys? Today I'm going to give you a very basic lesson on everything you need to know about the Titanic. Welcome to Titanic 101, your intro to all things Titanic. What's up, guys? It's Rap the Titanic Avila here, and welcome to my channel. Here we talk about Titanic, disasters, and other historical events. So if you're weirdly obsessed with disasters, then consider subscribing and joining our Titanic nerd community. Okay, so today I'm going to give you a lesson all about the Titanic. Now, this is going to be a very simplified lesson about everything that has to do with the idea of the Titanic, the building, the voyage, and the sinking itself. So this is a perfect video if, say, you're just getting into Titanic, if you want to share it with a friend who is maybe starting to get interested in Titanic, or if you need to learn something in school and you just want the basics. And seeing as we're now in April, this is Titanic month, I think this is a perfect opportunity for everyone to learn a little bit about the ship of dreams. Okay, so let's start off simple. What exactly is the Titanic? So the Titanic was a very famous ocean liner that sank in the middle of the North Atlantic back in April of 1912. And the story of the Titanic, the ship, has captivated people since 1912. There's something very special about it. So people continue to talk about it to this day, including myself. I've been obsessed ever since I was 7 years old. And now you're probably starting to get interested. So let's look at how the Titanic even came to be. Okay, so to understand the Titanic, let me set the stage. So at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s or early 1910s, the only way of doing any sort of ocean travel, transatlantic travel, was via ocean liners. But these ships, these big steamships, right? There were no airplanes. So if you wanted to travel from the United States to Europe and back and forth, you had to go via a steamship. Now, let me introduce you to two of the biggest shipping companies back in the day. You had the White Star Line, which is a company that owned the Titanic, and you had its rival, the Cunard Line. Now, both of these companies were fierce competitors, and you could think of it like Coke and Pepsi back in the day, constantly competing. Now, in the summer of 1907, the Cunard Line was about to release two brand new ships, the Mauretania and the Lusitania, and these ships were going to be the fastest ships in the world. Now, the White Star Line needed to respond, and they needed to respond quickly. How are they going to possibly compete with these two brand new ships that were going to be extremely fast, the fastest the world had ever seen? So, in a summer evening in 1907, there were two men that got together to have a business dinner. And these men were Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of the White Star Line, and William Lord Peary, who was the chairman of the shipbuilding company Harland and Wolff. That was a shipbuilding company for the White Star Line. Both of these gentlemen, they got together at Lord Peary's house in London, which actually that same building today is the Spanish embassy to Great Britain. Look it up. During the course of that dinner, these two men came up with a plan. Instead of competing on speed, they were going to compete on luxury and size. They decided that they were going to build the three biggest and most luxurious ships the world had ever seen. These ships were going to be called the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Gigantic. Quick side note, after the sinking of the Titanic, they decided to change that third ship from Gigantic to Britannic. By the end of that dinner, the idea was clearly formed, and that idea was about to become a reality. On July 31st of that same year, a contract was officially signed with Harland and Wolff with the shipyards in Belfast to build the Olympic, the Titanic, and later the Britannic. Now, there was a lot of work that had to be done before the ships could even begin construction. These were going to be massive ships. So Harland and Wolff, they had to make renovations in their shipyards. They had to build two big gantries. They had to expand their slipways in order to fit the keel. And finally, a year after that initial meeting, on December 16th, 1908, the keel was laid for the Olympic. And just a few months later, on March 31st, 1909, construction officially began on Titanic. Now, over the course of many months, thousands of workers worked both on the Olympic and Titanic at the same time. On October 10th, 1910, the Olympic's hull was officially launched, and then on May 31st, 1911, Titanic was officially launched and ready to be fitted out. Now, fitting out, this is when they started loading all of the heavy equipment, all the boilers, the engines, all the furniture, all of that started to be loaded into Titanic. And of course, that included Titanic's lifeboats. Now, let's talk about the lifeboats a little bit. Now, Titanic had these new type davits. Davits were those cranes that essentially held the lifeboats, and these were brand new davits called Welland davits. These Welland davits could have fit a total of 64 lifeboats on the Titanic. There's a lot that goes into this decision, but basically it was decided that they didn't need that many lifeboats. It would be too cluttered. They didn't need all that room. The Board of Trade law at the time only required the Titanic carry 16 lifeboats, and Titanic ended up carrying 20 lifeboats. So in fact, 4 lifeboats more than the law required. We're gonna need to talk about that in another video. Anyway, in early April, Titanic underwent her sea trial. She was officially deemed seaworthy, and she traveled from Belfast to Southampton in order to await her maiden voyage scheduled on April 10th, 1912. Titanic officially set sail on her maiden voyage on April 10th, 1912 at noon that very same day. Now, Titanic actually had 2 more ports of call. She was going to begin in Southampton, she was going to travel to France, stop at Cherbourg, then she was going to travel to Ireland in a place called Queenstown, also known as Cove today, and then she was going to head over to New York. Now, there's an incident that happened that a lot of people forget even happened because it wasn't shown in James Cameron's Titanic movie, and it wasn't shown in the 1958 A Night to Remember movie, but Titanic actually almost crashed with another ship, ironically also named the New York. Basically what happened was, as Titanic was moving along the canal, the displacement of the water caused suction, so the New York, which was moored there, her tethers broke, and she started swinging towards the Titanic, and they were about to collide. But at the very last moment, a tugboat was able to wrap a rope around the stern and then hold the ship back, hold the New York back so that it wouldn't hit Titanic. And then Titanic was just able to move out of the way, and then the New York was also moved out of the way. So it was a very, very close call. But a lot of passengers felt very nervous about this. They didn't like it. They thought it was a bad omen, that it was a bad sign, it was bad luck, especially since their destination was New York and the name of the ship was the New York. Because of this event, Titanic was late at arriving at Cherbourg, France. The next day, she arrived in Queenstown, Ireland, and this is where we actually get some famous photographs taken by Father Francis Brown. He took some photographs on the Titanic, and then he disembarked in Ireland in Queenstown, which is why they survive today, and they're very interesting. If you guys stick around, a little bit later, I'm going to show you some of these incredible, amazing pictures. Finally, later that day, on April 11th, 1912, Titanic set sail from Ireland and was on her way to New York. Now, the actual voyage itself was pretty uneventful. There were many accounts, people were just having a very, very good time, especially if you were in first class. They were enjoying a lot of the amenities and the new rooms that the ship had to offer. Now, the Titanic was a state-of-the-art ship at the time. This was the largest and most luxurious ship in the entire world. So let's take a tour real quick of some of Titanic's famous rooms. So as first class passengers embarked on Titanic, they would have reached the reception on D-deck. At the same time, they would have seen the dining saloon, the dining hall for first class. As they moved up the ship, they would have gotten to the very, very famous grand staircase located on A deck. Titanic also had many other dining rooms and cafes, including the Café Parisien, the a la carte restaurant, the Veranda and Palm Court Cafe. Actually, fun fact, this is where you see Rose and Cal. Near the beginning of the movie, this is where Rose sees Jack. There was also a reading and writing room for first class passengers. There was the first class smoking lounge. You could also go to the very fancy Turkish baths. And then, if you wanted to, you could go take a swim in the saltwater pool. This was a brand new thing at the time. It was quite exciting. There was also a barber shop. There was a gymnasium on the boat deck. And even the second class and third class accommodations were way better than they were on other ships. You can see the second class dining saloon. We can also see the third class dining saloon, a huge upgrade to what third class passengers would have found on other ships. So for 4 days, Titanic's passengers just enjoyed the ship. Everything was relatively uneventful. Now, we are at Sunday, April 14th, the day of the collision. So there were a few church services available since it was a Sunday, all throughout the ship for first class, second class, and I believe third class. And one thing that we should talk about are the ice warnings. So Titanic had 2 wireless operators, and they operated the wireless machine using Morse code. And this is how they communicated with other ships. So these transatlantic travel routes, they were very, very popular. So lots of ships were always updating each other on the weather conditions, on whether they saw ice. So Titanic actually got several ice warnings that day leading up to the collision. We'll talk about this in detail in another video, but Titanic did receive several ice warnings. Captain E.J. Smith, however, after many, many years of experience, he knew how to handle the ice. In fact, he actually moved the original course of Titanic further south in order to avoid that ice. So a lot of people say that he willingly went right into the ice, full speed ahead. He did course correct, and he just maintained standard protocol, continuing with the speed that he was going. Now this leads us to the night of the collision. So at approximately 11:40 p.m., the two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, they spot an iceberg. They see a mass from among the darkness, and Frederick Fleet rings a bell 3 times. He picks up the phone, he calls a bridge and says, "Iceberg right ahead." At the same time, First Officer Murdoch, who is the officer in charge, he also sees the iceberg, and he immediately orders hard to starboard, which means a left turn. So Quartermaster Hitchens immediately starts turning Titanic's wheel, and immediately the wheel goes hard over. Titanic begins to turn slightly, but unfortunately, it's too late, and Titanic collides with the iceberg just a short 37 to 40 seconds later. Now, the collision occurred on the starboard side, so the right side of the ship, and it basically grazed along the side of the ship, and unfortunately, it opened up 5 compartments and a little bit into the 6th compartment. Immediately after the collision, First Officer Murdoch ordered the watertight doors to be closed. Titanic had 16 watertight compartments, right? They were featured in magazines, and a lot of the publicity leading up to Titanic's maiden voyage, which is why a lot of people said Titanic was unsinkable because of these brand new safety features, although the White Star Line never officially claimed the Titanic was unsinkable. But it did have these new safety features. Now, the Titanic could stay afloat with up to 4 compartments filled with water, 4 compartments breached. Unfortunately, the iceberg opened up basically almost 6 compartments, 5.5 compartments, which essentially at this point, that meant this ship was doomed. There's nothing they could do. A few minutes later, Captain Smith goes into the bridge because he felt something and he asks what happened. First Officer Murdoch tells him what happened, and they immediately step into action, and he gets engineers and a couple of his officers to go and sound the ship, to do an investigation, find out what the damage is, what's the next course of action. Within 10 minutes, the water's already 14 feet above the keel, above the bottom of the ship. And by midnight, Thomas Andrews, who designed the ship, tells Captain Smith that Titanic will founder, Titanic will sink. By 12:05, the captain orders the lifeboats to be readied and to awaken all passengers. By 12:15, the band, the orchestra, they assemble outside the boat deck and they begin playing cheery, happy music in order to keep people calm, to avoid a panic. The one thing you gotta remember is there was no public service announcement system on Titanic. There was no PA system. They couldn't just speak over a loudspeaker or anything. So there was a lot of confusion during those first couple of minutes. So stewards went and awakened their passengers, and passengers were just told that it was a lifeboat drill, right? So people were slowly trickling up on deck, confused, cold. They didn't know what was happening. It was very noisy because the steam was going off in the funnel. So there was just a lot of confusion everywhere. At 12:25, the order is given to actually start loading the lifeboats. First Officer Murdoch on the starboard side of the ship goes by the rule women and children first. So if the women and children have been loaded, he did start letting men on. While on the port side, Second Officer Lightoller was a little bit more strict. He said women and children only. By 12:45, the first lifeboat is launched, which is lifeboat number 7 on the starboard side of the ship, and the evacuation keeps going. So in the first couple of minutes, those first lifeboats that leave, they're not very full. And the reason why is people were hesitant to get into these boats. You got to put yourself in their position. You have these rickety wooden boats. You're in the middle of the ocean. Everything is black. So why would a passenger step into these rickety boats? Didn't look very safe when they're on a supposedly unsinkable ship that's brightly lit up. You don't see any signs of danger, and it's nice and warm. That's why people were very hesitant trying to get into those boats. So those first lifeboats, a lot of them really went half empty. Now, as time progresses, the situation starts becoming a little bit more evident. By 1:15, the water is now at Titanic's nameplate. There's a significant list. And just a few minutes later, passengers really start to notice. They can feel that the ship is tilting. They can feel that list. By 1:30, there were significant signs of panic. People really start rushing those boats, and a lot of the boats in the forward section, they're all gone. So people really start rushing those boats toward the aft or the back of the ship. The situation quickly deteriorates. There's a lot of panic that breaks out, and it's becoming very noticeable and very evident that there are not enough lifeboats for all the passengers. By 2:05, the final lifeboat to be launched gets launched, and that is Collapsible D. Now at this point, there's still 2 lifeboats that remain on the ship, although they're stored on top of the officers' quarters, and there was no easy system designed to get them down. So a lot of the crew, they just put a bunch of oars on there and they push them off. But sadly, these boats were never launched because they ran out of time. By 2:10, the water is rushing over the deck, so both of these lifeboats, they just wash off the ship, Collapsible A and Collapsible B. At this point, everything happens very quickly. The band stops playing, people are screaming, they're running toward the stern of the ship, and at approximately 2:17, the stern rises up, Titanic breaks in half, and then by 2:20, she fully goes under the water and she sinks on April 15th, 1912. And 1,500 people, 1,500 people go into that water and would never come out. So for those first couple of minutes, those 20 lifeboats, they just sat there and listened to the screams of the people because there was not a lot that they could do. If they went back, it's most likely that the people struggling in the water would pull them down, right? So a lot of them just sat there covering their ears, trying to drown out the noise of those people pleading for their lives as they slowly froze to death. Eventually, the sea got quiet as people died of hypothermia. Now, at approximately 3:30 a.m., there are rockets that are seen in the distance of a ship. And this is a ship that comes to rescue them. The name of that ship was the RMS Carpathia. Luckily, before the ship went down, the 2 wireless operators were able to get a hold of many other ships, and the Carpathia was one of those ships that immediately rushed to the position of where Titanic was sinking. By 4:10 a.m., the first lifeboat is picked up by Carpathia, then a rescue mission goes underway, and by 8:30 a.m. on April 15th, the last of Titanic's lifeboats gets picked up by Carpathia. Carpathia then switches course and heads to New York. While on the Carpathia's passengers took care of the Titanic survivors. They gave them food, soup, water, blankets, and they really tried to take care of them. They really accommodated them. Carpathia sailed for a few days, and on April 18th, Carpathia finally arrived in New York with the 705 people who survived the Titanic. And that, Titanic nerds, is where we're going to end the story today. In total, there were approximately 1,500 people that died on the Titanic, with approximately 705 survivors. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to talk about. This is an event that really affected the world significantly. We're still talking about it 109 years later. So this was a basic summary of the short but magnificent life of the Titanic. So there you have it, guys. Let me know if that was helpful. Leave me a comment down below. Also, let me know if there's any details that I didn't talk about that you would like me to talk about, and we can go into a much more detailed discussion about that. Now that you guys know the basics of Titanic, I actually have a lot of other compilations where I talk about general Titanic facts. You guys can check out the playlist right over here, or here, wherever it is on the screen. Also, I know you guys have been staring at my super awesome shirt that happens to match the poster on my wall. And you guys can get your very own shirt at my merch store, titanicguy.com. So there's a bunch of products over there. Anyway, guys, if you enjoyed this video, you consider yourself a Titanic nerd, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and then join our community of Titanic nerds. And anyway, just for subscribing, I got a little something extra for you. So these are some of my favorite pictures of the real Titanic that were taken by Father Brown in Ireland. And I hope you guys enjoy that.